Let's bow our heads in prayer. Lord, our holy God, our Creator, the Creator who is filled with mercy and forgiveness and patience. And we give you great thanks for this day that you have made, for this place that we can gather, for the food that's been prepared for us. And we give thanks also for those individuals who are volunteers, for those who serve our country, and for entities, the Braun Foundation, who supports this meal with generous donations. And for this day, we call upon your great power that there would be healing amongst those who ask for healing, that your wisdom would come upon us and guide us in all that we do, that every day we would give you thanks. We ask this in your name. Amen. Amen. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. Larry Head, please lead us in the singing of our national anthem.
Thank you, John. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you, Larry.
Good morning. Thank you for all attending today. Thank you for bringing some friends. Thank you for bringing some new people. Very important talk today. You had it a week ago. We changed the schedule a little bit last week and threw some people off. Sorry about that. That's not happened before. Hopefully it doesn't happen too many times in the future, but we had a school here and we had that type of restriction. My name is Mark Browning, and I'm part of the Evansville Wartime Museum. And the first thing I like to do is compliment infrastructure. The gentleman's going to talk today. He won't let me talk about him, so I'll talk about him because he can't stop me right now. He's in charge of microphones, so he may be able to stop me. But if you look at a lot of these red shirts around here, that's the infrastructure of this place. If you go to a third world country or another country, why do they all want to come here? Because our infrastructure is so well done. You've got highways, you've got electricity, you've got plumbing, If any of you have worked in third world countries, you know how nice this place is. This is absolutely what I'd say sort of utopia. So you have experienced that, your kids and grandkids are experiencing it. But the same thing in this museum, we have what we call infrastructure. The gentleman's going to talk today. You've got good temperature in here because he works on the AV system. You had the snow cleared because he cleared the snow. You have the tank working because he gets inside it and fixes it. This AV system is probably one of the best in the city because he messes with that. That's just a few things he does. But I could brag about every person in a red shirt out here. I couldn't say enough about them. That's called the infrastructure of this place, the same as the infrastructure of our country. That's why this place works so well. Mr. John Gross, who just did the prayer, is absolutely superb. He's able to organize things. Myself, I can't do that, but he organizes and makes this thing work right. I have a few announcements. I know you don't want to hear them all. And if you get tired with our question and answers, you can walk out, but the question and answers hopefully will persist. That's an important part of lunch, learn, and share. The S is share, and we learn more from you than we learn from ourselves sometimes. The first announcement is the first day of spring is 3/21/26. You can debate that if you want to, but we're going to have Rosie the Riveter Day. You think Rosie the Riveter just puts rivets in those planes, but Rosie the Riveters, there's about 12 different kinds of Rosie Riveters. We will have them stationed around the museum, and bring your grandkids, nieces, and nephews, because that will be a good day. We will have Miss Lucy Wansey there, who's only 100 years old, and will answer questions. She was a riveter on the back of the plane.
Mark, there's no cost. That's a free day.
That is 3/21/26 is a free day. I'm sorry. It's a free day, so that's even better. All right. Now, you grandparents teach kids, aunts and uncles teach kids. Kids don't always listen to their parents, so it's up to you to bring some grandkids out. Now, on 4/18/26, that's a little down the road, but 4/18/26 is going to be our Revolutionary War Day. Remember, this is a 250-year. Can you hear me back there? This is a 250-year anniversary of our country. We've just opened an exhibit back there on the Revolutionary War. Very important period of time up even in Vincennes, and it talks about the war up in Vincennes. But the Revolutionary War, we will have over 10 people from the Sons of the American Revolution dressed in their attire. We will have an opening ceremony. We'll have a ribbon cutting of that. We will have Mr. Bob Cleveland, who's president of the Sons of the American Revolution. He will demonstrate the long gun. The long gun probably used in our history more than any other gun we've had, because it's used from the 1600s all the way till the mid-1800s, even during the Civil War some. He will talk about the flint, talk about loading it. You had to load that 3 times a minute to qualify. If I loaded it, it'd take about 5 minutes, but it's not easy to load, but all the soldiers had to do that. We will also have a demonstration of the fife and the drum. The fife is the musical instrument used by the English and the Americans during that wartime to communicate. The pipe is a small pipe, and we have one person that has one of the original pipes. So that will be that day. We'll have a student that's helped us named Isaac, who helped us put that display together. He will be able to answer many questions. In the first week of April, April 6th through 9th, we will have the Medal of Honor recipient here. His name is Don Ballard. He's coming from Kansas. Kenny Gwynn's a good friend of his. There's only 56 of those left in the world today. There was 3,000 plus at one time, most of them from the Civil War, but a Medal of Honor recipient is a pretty big deal. We had one from Indiana that talked at Crossroads, and there were 3,000 people there about 5 years ago. This gentleman you will be able to hear if you sign up for Lunch and Learn on the 9th for your usual cost of $0. If you have friends that want to hear him, he will be at University of Southern Indiana the day before in the evening on 4/8/2026 at 6 p.m. And that Medal of Honor winner will be there. I'd love to have any of you go and listen to him, ask questions. Dr. Edward Brundick is going to moderate things at a couple high schools here also that night. and will help facilitate that. The West Side Festival is also hosting in one night. So those are a lot of announcements. You probably can't remember anything I said, but that's what we're about in the near future. Now, I can't tell you enough about this guy that's going to talk, and I'm not going to say any more about him, but he's Mr. Student of Mr. Von Braun. And remember, we had the trump card. When you go play bridge, you got to have a trump card to play clapper. You got to have a trump card. Our trump card in World War II was the atom bomb. But he's going to talk about Hitler's trump card. This rocket really about got us. And it was just about the trump card. And he talked about the German part, and now he's going to talk about the American part. So this is Mr. Tom David. He's an integral part of the museum, and I can't say enough about him. I'm going to shut up.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Appreciate that. Well, this will be our second part. I don't know how many were here last week. I'm just kind of curious, kind of give me an idea. This segment will be his second part of his life. He came to the United States, and I wanted to start our program today to dedicate this to my Uncle Charles David. He was my father's oldest brother. He would find himself in employment at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, and would actually work on Von Braun's team down there developing rockets in the early 60s. So I'm going to dedicate this program to him. I'm going to talk a little bit about his correspondence during that time at the end of this program and share some pretty good stories that he told me. So I will today refer to him as Dr. Wherner von Braun. And the reason why is because that was his wish when he came to the United States. He did not call himself Berner. He wanted to Americanize himself. So he would reach out to everybody and say, my name's Wherner von Braun. He was born in 1912 in Wurz, Prussia. That was before World War I. He would pass away at the young age of 65 in 1977 at Alexandria, Virginia. I'm going to do something a little different this time. I've decided to let a lot of pictures tell the story instead of having a lot of verbiage in my slides. I don't know if this will work, but we're going to try it today. I will recap this real quickly. If you were here last week, in the end of 1944, the Department of Defense realized that Germany was going to fall. There was no doubt. I mean, it didn't fall until mid-45, but they decided that, you know what, we need to investigate the possibility of, and I'll just go ahead and read this, recruit German scientists, engineers, and technicians to leverage their expertise for military and I can't talk this morning, I'll get it out. Technology advancement. So, one of the main reasons, let's beat the Russians to them, right? That was one of them. We were still fighting in Japan at the time that they were thinking about this. They had no idea when that conflict in the Pacific would end. So they really thought it would be important to go after the technicians, engineers, and scientists that were developing a lot of high-tech stuff. Is what I'm going to call it. Later on, they would call this Operation Paperclip. It was first called Operation Overcast. It would last about 4 years. There was 1,500 approximately scientists, engineers, technicians came over during this time. Von Braun's team would be around 127. There's a great story on how they ended up finding him, but I'm not going to have time to go into a lot of details. But he would surrender to the United States. He would work his way south. The Soviet armies coming from the east, we're coming, and our allies are coming from the west. He would plan is escape with his team. His team was part of this, and they would surrender to the United States Army in the Bavarian area of Germany in the Alps. I wanted to go ahead real quickly, and I showed this picture last week. This is Von, I chose this picture because this is Von Braun, and to his right is General Walter Dornberger. That was his superior officer. Dornberger was the general and the commander at the Army Research Facility in Peenemünde, where Von Braun would indeed develop the V-2 missile, the ballistic missile. So this was a member. You know, they were actually surrendering here. Dornberger ended up not coming right away. Long story, but he ended up. The British wanted him. They were actually considering to interrogate him and to maybe prosecute him. And I kind of misspoke last week. They actually did not prosecute him in court. They interrogated him. Excuse me, my tongue's tied this morning. For 2 years. They kept him for 2 years. They finally decided after that time that they didn't proceed with a prosecution. They let him go, and his wish was to come to the United States real quickly. He went to the Air Force. Not everybody went with Von Braun. A lot of these scientists would go in all areas of the United States. He would end up at the Air Force working for, laying the groundwork in his research that actually led to the development of the X-15 jet plane. I don't know if you're familiar with that story, but he was actually laying the groundwork for that, and that X-15 led to the space shuttle technology. So, they moved him to Fort Bliss, Texas. This is near, it was actually almost basically in El Paso, right on the Mexican border in Texas. This is a famous picture of all of them. Like I said, there's about 127 of them. Von Braun is right here. So that was a group picture that they took when they arrived at Fort Bliss. The gentleman that escorted him by train from the East Coast to Fort Bliss was named Major Hamill. He is actually the commander at Fort Bliss. This is a picture of Von Braun and Hamill. When they brought Von Braun's team, they brought almost 300 rail cars of parts of the V-2 rocket that Von Braun developed in Germany, and they brought them to Fort Bliss. They actually would assemble these rockets and continue to upgrade them and show the Army how they work. And that was done at White Sands Missile Range. Anybody familiar with White Sands? Okay, that's where they would do it. It was about 80 to 90 miles north of El Paso. So that's the area where they would actually launch the vehicles, or the rockets, I mean, and continue to test them and make small improvements to the. This is just a quick picture. That's one of them at White Sands. Being they would have a hydraulic system that would actually elevate it to the launch pad. I want to talk about this real quick. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about what they did in Fort Bliss because I want to keep this rolling, but I have to mention this story. So what you see right here on this rocket, I'm actually going to go ahead and go to the next picture because you can see it better. This is the rocket that's actually in flight. And if you notice real quickly, at the nose of that rocket, you'll see that's actually another rocket. So what they did is, this was called the Bumper Series, and they worked with Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, California. They developed a small rocket, and they made a two-stage vehicle out of it, a rocket. And the V-2 was the first stage, and the second stage was called the WAC Corporal. So this was a big development for them. They made a two-stage rocket, and they would set all kind of altitude records. They would go over 200 miles in elevation with this combination. Sometimes things didn't always work out. So I'm just giving you an idea. In this era, they do the best they can on that drawing board, but sometimes either from an assembly issue or an engineering issue, they'd have problems, and this is one of them blowing up at White Sands. This is a picture that was taken, a very famous picture. This is Von Braun standing next to it. This was actually a shell of a V2, and of course they made a sign recognizing White Sands, the Sands Proving Grounds. I want to go ahead and share this with you. The next topic of discussion is Von Braun would always talk about this era in his life as stagnant. He wasn't really, it wasn't that he was that discouraged, but he didn't see himself proceeding with what his real dream was. And that was, of course, space exploration, space technology, and putting man in space, travel to the stars. This was his dream when he was 13 years old in Germany. I shared that, of course, in last week's talk, but this was a flame burning within him every day he walked on this earth, was to do this. So during this period, toward the end was the bumper series, there was something that happened on the world stage that kind of interjected a new era. The Soviet Union would have their first successful test of detonating an atomic bomb. This happened in 1949, and of course our Department of Defense would start to realize, our adversary, which was the Cold War, was starting to develop technology that they knew that if they had the bomb, it would just be a matter of time that they would have this technology that Von Braun was working with also. So they decided, the Department of Defense decided to move him. The Germans were very happy about this. They were in the desert sands, of course, in El Paso. They would move him to the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I wish I had more time to talk about the history of Redstone, but I'll just say that it was a product of World War II. It was over 30,000 acres in Huntsville, and it was a munitions facility. And it was a product of World War II. They would move him there. What I have here is just a couple pictures of aerial view of some of the buildings that they would build to bring the Germans to Huntsville. And Von Braun would then get the opportunity to expand and work on a new program called the Redstone rocket. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Redstone, but it will make history, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So this will happen around 1950, and during this time, real quickly, just to give you a quick, show you real quickly, this is Major General Medeiros. He's the commander at Fort Bliss, and the gentleman to Von Braun's left, and back then he was a major. I think in this picture he's now Brigadier General. That's General Toftoy. He's responsible for bringing Von Braun over during Operation Paperclip. Okay, I didn't comment, but when Von Braun was at Fort Bliss, he wrote a book called The Mars Project. He was going to try to ignite the American public of the idea of space exploration. It wasn't received well. A lot of publishers turned it down, but they gave some constructive criticism, and he would turn around. In 1952, the editor of Collier's magazine decided to write a series of articles from 52 to 54 about space. They decided, this is coming, let's get it out there. And Von Braun would write a couple articles at that time. This one became very famous, Crossing the Last Frontier by Dr. Von Braun. Anybody ever seen the movie 2001: Space Odyssey? Not one of my favorite movies. Does that look familiar? All right, where do you think they got the idea? Right there. That was a vision of Von Braun's space station that he would write about in that article. This turned around and really started him down a path to start to become a household name. people started to recognize who he was and what he was actually about, wanting to explore space. So this article, in fact, they actually, I think, published almost 3 million copies of this. It was a very popular article at the time. That article would find its way to the desk to none other than Walt Disney. Walt Disney is building or in the process of designing Disneyland. Part of that park was going to be Tomorrowland. And when he saw this article, he saw some genius. He reached out to him and they actually became good friends and they would help each other. Von Braun would share with him a lot of vision, and in retrospect, Mr. Disney would actually sponsor him and produce a program for him to air on the airwaves. So I think they did 2 of them in 1955. I think they did the last one in 57. But Von Braun would get a chance to share his thoughts about advancing space exploration. And this was a huge deal. Everybody would get to see him in the living rooms, and they knew who he was. And they realized that there was something there that could be very interesting with space exploration. I'm going to stop here for a minute. We're going to talk about this, but I need to step back and get back to Von Braun and some history here. So when he's exposing this to everybody, the Department of Defense actually came to him. Actually, he went up there to D.C., and they started talking about the possibility of launching satellites. This was going to be like the first step, right? This would be the first area that they would explore into. And of course, he was all over this with them. He would explain to them his vision. They would talk about the fact that what it could do to contribute to the scientific community. And also, he would also bring up if our adversaries would head in this direction, that not only would it could possibly be a problem from a military aspect. Of course, he was talking about the Soviet Union. So, a lot of scientists got together in the early 50s. I'm going to name one of them. His name was James Van Allen. Anybody heard that name? So James Van Allen, a lot of them started talking in the scientific community about the possibilities of putting a satellite in orbit for learning about our globe, or from a perspective of just not weather, but other areas. He was real interested about the radiation belt. Now, as we start to ring a bell, he was interested about the radiation belt around our Earth. So they would start talking about the possibility of having what they would call the International Geophysical Year. And in 1955, our President Eisenhower, would announce that we would have this event and we would kick it off by the United States putting a satellite in orbit. And this became an issue where Von Braun would go to them in 1956. He was developing the Jupiter C rocket in Huntsville, and he would tell our government, I've got the vehicle that will do it. And they turned him down at that time because of his ties to Germany. Okay, it was still haunting him, and also for the fact that Eisenhower was concerned that if we would launch a military rocket for this event, that it would be perceived the wrong way. There was also another little glitch. Eisenhower was concerned if we put a satellite up first, what were the Soviets going to say if we invaded their airspace? What would they call their airspace? So it was kind of a touch and go situation, but nonetheless, they did go ahead and decide to come forward. The Vanguard rocket was being developed by the Navy, and I need to point this out. It wasn't just the Army in the 50s developing rocket programs. The Air Force was working with systems. Convair was one of their manufacturers, part of General Dynamics. And the Navy had a system called the Vanguard rocket. And the Navy stood up and said, wait a minute, we have the answer. Here's the competition, right, between the Army and the Navy. We suggest you let us send our Vanguard up with that satellite, with a weather satellite. So this became a struggle. They would end up going to Washington. Von Braun would give his presentation, the Navy would give theirs, and as my uncle would always say, this was already decided. They were not going to give this to Von Braun because of his association with the Nazi regime at that time. He was still carrying that baggage, of course. I will comment real quickly, to try to help with this, they actually, Von Braun and most of his associates there at Redstone would become American citizens in 1955. So he wanted to show his loyalty to this country, to express, and he still, of course, wanted to reach his dream. So I wanted to share that with you because this is a very important part of the space race. Sputnik. The Vanguard system, they were lacking. They were supposed to put it in orbit in 1957, and they were having a lot of problems. So the Soviets, on October the 4th, 1957, launched their satellite and shocked the world. The ramifications of this is hard to explain because this started to really work on the psyche of the American public. Because the first thing they're going to start saying is, well, if they can do this, what else can they do? Are we going to be spied on? Are we going to have warheads headed at us on this rocket if they got the capability of doing this? So this was a huge, huge deal for the Eisenhower administration. He would go ahead and defend his administration by getting forward or coming forward to the American public and say, look, it's just a sphere. It's just a ball with a transmitter that goes beep, 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 because that's what it did. But the fact that they did it was the important part. But he would point out, we're doing it too. Our rocket's almost ready. We're going to answer this. This is the rocket that the Soviet Union perfected to launch Sputnik, and it would rain for years to help the Soviet Union beat us to the punch on a lot of different programs during the space race. It was called the R-7. Our rockets could only launch a payload of about a ton, 2,000 pounds. This rocket could carry something into space that weighed 10 tons, 20,000 pounds. So that's how far advanced they came in just a short period of time. Von Braun was very, very upset about this. He had been constantly working with the Department of Defense, trying them to head into larger rockets. This will answer the call. This will ignite the space race, of course. And they would use this all through the beginning of the Soviet Union space program. Real quickly, I'll just mention the gentleman behind this was named Sergei Korolev. He was the genius that put this system together and made it work. So in December of 1957, everybody familiar with this? A lot of people, maybe a lot of you haven't heard the story. Navy gets a chance, they finally bring the rocket to the Cape. It went 3 feet in the air and disintegrated. And this was huge because in the Soviet Union, if they had a failure on the launch pad, nobody knew it. Nobody was going to know their failure. But in the United States with the free press, everybody's there. I mean, this was a huge deal. We got the press corps there, we got all the major networks, everybody's focused on this launch. And unfortunately for us and for the Navy, it failed. Well, of course, this would give the green light to Von Braun, obviously. They would come to him and say, we have to answer. He was actually prepared to some extent, knowing that this would probably happen. the Vanguard system was just, it was just too early in its development. It was just not going to be able to have successful launches one right after the other one. I will comment, because a lot of people don't know this history, they would make it successful later on and launch satellites with it. I was surprised. When I was doing a lot of my research with my uncle, I did not realize this. By 1960, we had almost 60 satellites in the air. And that was astounding to me. I didn't realize we launched that. But anyway, they did finally make it successful. Von Braun's team would bring a rocket to the Cape called the Jupiter C. And this is a picture of it launching. They did it at night. You'll notice at the very top, right here, is the nose of it. And I'm going to explain this a little bit of this history. So to celebrate this is a famous picture. And of course, this is Von Braun in the foreground here. You can see this is the actual model of the rocket, the Jupiter C. And what they're holding up, I want to comment about this, was the fourth stage that they developed. And it was JPL that developed this. It wasn't Von Braun, it was JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, California. They developed, that was the same one that developed the White Corporal that I talked about. They developed this little stage, and right here, of course, was the satellite, and the gentleman in the middle is James Van Allen. He designed the equipment to do what he wanted to do, and they'd incorporated it in this flight. So this flight was called Explorer 1, our first satellite that would orbit the Earth, and he would discover the famous Van Allen belt. That's a mark in history that they talk about sometimes. So the gentleman on the end worked, I don't remember his name, but he worked with JPL. This was a huge celebration, of course, and of course this would make Von Braun really focused now. A lot of people knew who he was after he was able to accomplish this. So Eisenhower had a problem. His administration decided that they did not want our space program to be military. They're already competing with each other. The Air Force is developing the system. We'll talk about the Atlas rocket in a minute. Of course, the Navy had the Vanguard, and of course, Von Braun was working with the Jupiter C and was continuing to try to improve their payload or the size of the rocket as he was developing them in Huntsville. So the Eisenhower decided, we're not going to make our space program military. We're going to have a civilian organization. NASA is born. National Aeronautics Space Administration. This happened in 1958. And this is the part of history a lot of people, I didn't know this. My uncle worked with Von Braun, and that's all I ever heard about. And when anybody talked about NASA, I was always thinking about Huntsville. So, of course, that was just me because my uncle worked there. But what they did, they made the headquarters in DC, started organizing this organization. And Von Braun wasn't invited to the dance right away. A lot of people aren't aware of this. Because a lot of people associate him with NASA, that he was brought into the fold right away. He was not. At Langley, Virginia, some of you may be familiar with this. Anybody ever heard of the NACA? It was established in 1915, and it was an aeronautical research center. And actually, the World War I started that. They would actually, the government had a facility, they had a lot of wind tunnels, and they would do aeronautical research for a lot of manufacturers. So they decided, they already had a group there. They would call themselves the Space Task Group. They got, a bunch of them got together in the 50s and started talking about what it would take to put a man in space. So they were also gearing up for this idea. So they decided to bring Langley Research Center into the development, and they did a lot at the beginning of NASA. Now, Von Braun still is not with NASA at this time, and they would. I have the whole list right here. I can't remember them by heart. There was actually at the end of this era, there were 10 facilities that were tied to NASA. 10. And Langley would be one of the first. So they were tasked, the first mission was Project Mercury. Let's put a man in space. And I forgot to mention this, so I'm gonna go back to this. After we put our first satellite up, they put up Sputnik 2. Anybody know what was on that flight? Anybody know what they put up? They put a dog up named Laika. And then again, I forgot to mention this a while ago, that was a huge deal again, because Eisenhower started to realize, man's next. So NASA's gonna start working on the Mercury program. Langley would be in charge, they actually would be in charge of finding 7 astronauts for the 7 missions that Mercury would perform. A lot of you may know that history, but they were the ones that were tasked with that. Lyndon B. Johnson, by the way, was very involved in the space organization, and he would direct a lot of this taking place also. So the Mercury project is born. They have their astronauts, but they need a launch vehicle to put that capsule. But I forgot to mention, by the way, they also, the Space Task Group, had engineers that were designing the capsule, the Mercury capsule. They were designing that at Langley. But they needed a launch vehicle. Again, they didn't go to Von Braun. Again. The Air Force, in conjunction with Convair, was developing the Atlas rocket, which would be powerful enough to put that space capsule in orbit. And so they started working on the idea of injecting this into the Mercury program. Even though it was considered a military weapon, they knew that they needed to get involved in this space race and get a man in space before the Russians did. I only had one problem. There's several stories about this. But the astronauts would be at the Cape, and they would bring the Atlas rocket down there for the testing of their system, and they were having a lot of problems. And it was blowing up right in front of these astronauts. So you can imagine how they felt. You know, you can just picture what was going through, and not just them, their wives, right? What has my husband got himself into? And so Eisenhower finally decided we need to bring Von Braun. 1960, Fort Bliss, Texas, Redstone Arsenal's group would be brought away from the Army. The Army Ballistic Missile Agency was what they were tied to, and would bring that fold into NASA's organization. One of the decisions that prompted this was Eisenhower realized that there was it was too counterproductive to have all the military branches trying to do the same thing. So the Air Force then would get the opportunity to develop the ballistic missiles, the intermediate, and then the long-range missiles. The Titan II would come. These would be the Minutemen that we would have in our silos. The Army would be tasked with, a lot of times they would call it field rockets, surface-to-air missile defense systems. That would be their task at Redstone. They would develop this at Redstone. My cousin, who is Charles's son, is still active down there working for a contractor, and that's what they work on. So Von Braun's team finally comes aboard, and they realize that they're still dealing with the Atlas problem. Von Braun suggests, look, let's get a man in space as quick as we can. We'll use the Redstone rocket. It wasn't powerful enough to put him in orbit, but it would put him in what they would call suborbital flight. So they're organizing this and preparing the Atlas rocket to accept the capsule, and there was only one thing that would happen: the Russians would beat us again. So in April, gotta get my dates, of '61, Yuri Gagarin would orbit the Earth in Vostok 1. And of course, their R7 had all the power it needed to make this happen. We were able to answer finally, a month later. Alan Shepard was the first astronaut to go into space, and he was a little upset with Von Braun because if he could have went on the flight that he originally was supposed to go on, they would have beat the Russians by 1 month. Von Braun was concerned with some of the testing of the Redstone. They had a few problems and he wanted one more test flight before he sent the astronauts up. He did not want the United States to lose an astronaut in this program. It would probably be the end, and he knew that. So they were very driven for testing. So we had 2 flights with the Redstone rocket. Alan Shepard was the first suborbital, second was Gus Grissom. The last remaining 5 flights would be done with the Alice. And of course, the 3rd flight was John Glenn. He would be the first American astronaut to orbit the Earth. So that's the history of how the Mercury program was started. I forgot to show you this picture real quickly. This is in, I'll go ahead and share this with you. I kind of left this out a while ago. So when Von Braun was brought into NASA, they would take part of Redstone and they would start what was called the George C. Marshall Space Flight Center. Most of the time it's just called Marshall Space Flight Center. And it was named after George C. Marshall, famous general. And they would build new buildings. So the Space Flight Center is encompassed inside Redstone. And these are some of the buildings that they built. Von Braun would work out of one of these during that time. In 1958, Von Braun was working on the Saturn rocket. And I always call the Saturn I and the Saturn 1B the forgotten rockets, because nobody talks about them. But that was the beginning of Saturn program. He was actually starting to work on this, and his goal was, and he reached that goal, was to develop a medium-sized rocket that would be almost exactly to what the R-7 could do. And that was to lift a payload of about 10 tons. Real quickly, some pictures here. This is the Redstone with the Mercury capsule up above. Another picture of the Atlas rocket. That's what it would look like with the capsule if John Glenn was going up. And back to the development of the Saturn rocket. They were trying to develop something that would eventually be involved with the idea of going to the moon. They wanted to start building something that was going to be able to lift a payload. And they would do it very quickly. And the reason why I point this out, I'm just curious, I'm going to throw this out there. Did anybody ever stop at a rest stop between Tennessee and Alabama on Interstate 65? Anybody remember the rocket in the air? That was the Saturn 1B. It's no longer there. They took it down just not long ago. This is actually a test stand that was built at the Space Flight Center there in Huntsville. This is housing the first stage of a test firing of Saturn I. It's very distinctive. If you look at the bottom of it, or the bottom of the stages, you can kind of individually see these round tanks. That's how I always knew it was a Saturn I or 1B. They would take old hardware. So these are all tanks. This is a tank of the Redstone rocket. They would take a lot of hardware and assemble and use that hardware in the development of this rocket. This is another picture of Von Braun at the Cape. Of course, in the background is the Saturn I. Von Braun became good friends with most of the astronauts. They all liked him. I show this picture, it's a famous picture with them together here. I can't name them all, but that's definitely Gus there. There's Alan Shepard, John Glenn, Deke Slayton, and there's Von Braun right here. There's a gentleman named Bob Ward. If any of you YouTube, if you go out there and YouTube and search stuff, there's a gentleman by the name of Bob Ward, which is was Von Braun's press secretary. He's got some great videos about Von Braun's personal life. And he would talk about, he would invite the astronauts to the house, and they'd stay up all hours of the night talking about space. So he had a good connection with a lot of people. I didn't share this yet with this group, I talked about this a little bit more last week. Von Braun was not just a great engineer. He was a good engineer, don't get me wrong, but he was a master at communicating, a master. And he was so good of bringing all these people in, all these great minds, and getting the head in one direction. My uncle would always say, if you can bring 10 Germans to a room and get them all to agree on one thing, you've done something. So he always would make that comment. He could tell some more stories that got a little spicy, but we won't go there. We have a new president. When he was first elected in the middle of this race, he was asked a couple times about the space program, and he really didn't come back with too many answers. He really was focused. He had a lot of problems, as we all know, with Beta Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he had a lot of things going on in his mind. But when they launched Gagarin and Circle the Earth, he knew that we got to get on board. And by the way, I didn't mention this. I was going to tell you, the Premier Khrushchev was having a heyday. He was taunting the United States. He would get in front of people and talk about how far behind we were and how great they were, and that they were leading the world in this technology. He would go on and on with his propaganda. He would even suggest later on during Kennedy's administration that maybe the United States needs some help. You know, they're a third world country, right? That's how he would feed the flames. And then, of course, Kennedy became very, very upset with this, with a couple of meetings that he had with Khrushchev. And he decided when he came back, we're going to beat those guys, right? But we got to find out what we're going to beat them at, because they were first in a lot of things because of the R7 in its early development. So, of course, they got the think tank together. He came down actually to Huntsville. This is actually him meeting Von Braun at the Cape, but he would come to Huntsville and they would discuss, or Lyndon B would be behind this, most of it. What can we do in the future to beat the Soviet Union? And of course, the answer was go to the moon first. So the famous speech that President Kennedy would give at Rice University was the famous "We will go to the moon" speech. I'm sure a lot of you heard this. And when I was young, I always remember this, because he would say, "We're going to go to the moon and do the other thing." And of course, I wasn't, but about probably in the 6th grade at the time. I was younger than that. I was like, I looked at my dad and go, "What's the other thing?" You know. Well, that was to bring them safely back up. So they would meet, they would hit it off. They would kind of have a relationship, a friendship, and Von Braun took a liking to Kennedy. And of course, Von Braun now is living his dream. He's no longer building military rockets. Now he's doing what he wants to do. This is another famous picture of them when Kennedy came down for one of the tests. This was during the Saturn I era. And of course, this is a famous picture they took of Von Braun and Kennedy down there during that time. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about everything that happened in the later 60s, because what did we all do in July of 1969? We finally landed. So I don't have time to go through every rocket, every mission that they did. But we had the Mercury program. Our stepping stone was what? The Gemini program. That's where we learned to dock spacecraft in orbit and learn how to walk in space and do a lot of the other things that would lead to the Apollo program. And of course, the Apollo program was a huge issue for Von Braun's team and NASA, because they did not know when Kennedy announced he was going to do this, or he was going to set that goal by the end of the decade. NASA's looking at each other going, how are we going to do it? They didn't have a mission mode. They had no clue how they were going to accomplish this. And this became a huge struggle in NASA, and I don't have time to go into this. Later on, if you want to come up, we can talk about this for hours. But they had a huge struggle on how to do it because Von Braun envisioned a couple different ways. Direct ascent to the moon with an enormous rocket, or do what they called Earth Orbit Rendezvous. They would kind of build a little space station. They would lift up parts, assemble it, and take it to the moon. Earth Orbit Rendezvous. There was a young engineer in NASA said, no. That's not the way to do it. We'll talk about him some other time, because he's a story in a story. But he came up with a moon orbit rendezvous, and of course that's how they did it. Their payload would be the command module, the service module, the Apollo capsule on top, and then they would extract the lunar excursion module out of the first stage. They'd go up, when they left Earth, they would turn it around, grab the lunar module, the bug, the spider, they called it all kinds of names, and take it to the moon. 2 astronauts would go down, of course, and 1 would stay in the command module. So anyway, this is a famous picture of Von Braun. This is at the Cape. That was that was built by Marion Shovel Company. Everybody ever heard of Marion? They built this tractor platform that would carry the launch vehicles to their pad. And that's a picture of that. This is another famous picture. I think Mr. Head said, "You gonna make sure to show this?" I said, "Yes, we will." This is a famous picture. This is him in Huntsville. Later in life, they have a museum there. And at that time, they actually had the Saturn V rocket outside, laying on its side. And that was a picture of him taken next to it. That's the famous 5 engines. They were called the F1, built by Rocketdyne out in California. They would develop 1.5 million pounds of thrust, and with a combination of 5 of them, they lift 7 million pounds with Saturn V. So I'm going to go ahead. The reason why I don't want to go on with the programs, I want to spend a little bit of time here real quickly talking about my uncle to wrap this up. I brought this picture up because anybody recognize this? I'm just curious if anybody recognizes this. This was a building built in Huntsville at Marshall Space Flight Center. And my uncle would always comment that they were very proud of the Saturn program. And I'm not talking about just the 5, the other 2 rockets also. And the reason why they were very proud, they had a total of 32 launches, and this included the test launches. And they never had a catastrophic failure. Never. Now they had some problems in some of the flights, but they were able to work through those problems because of the redundancy built into the system. So this was a huge accomplishment. A lot of people don't talk about this, but nobody saw a Saturn rocket explode in its mission. In order to do that, my uncle introduced me to this. This was called the dynamic test stand. My uncle and a lot of engineers called it the shaker building. They would assemble the rocket in this complex at Marshall Space Flight Center there in Huntsville. And they would literally hook up arms to it, and they would shake this rocket. They would literally put it through dynamic forces that it would be exposed to during its flight. And my uncle shared with me the amount of knowledge they learned from these tests was unbelievable. They had a lot of failures in electronics. My uncle was involved in this, and I'll explain in a minute. On this rocket, they had what was called the IU ring, instrument unit. This was where a lot of the electronic components were. It was always in the top stage. It would be the guidance, it would be the communication through this. It actually had a destruct mechanism built into it also. Because if the rocket would go astray, they would want to make sure that of course, they had to jettison for the capsule to get off first, but they would blow the rocket up before it would hurt anybody. So my uncle worked, let me decide where I'm going to go. My uncle and a co-worker brought it up to the attention of the Von Braun team, a what if. And that was an island 90 miles away named Cuba. What could happen if the Soviet Union would try to jam communications? It would be a security issue. If they would pull it off, they could get the rocket to go astray, we would have to blow it up, and they would accomplish the mission. So this got a little bit of attention. And so a team of 3 people, my uncle included, would come up with a program called Secure, I gotta stop and think here because I don't have it written down, Secure Frequency Modification Communication System. And my uncle would always laugh about this because it was so vague. Now, my uncle gets real technical with me and I'd have to, sit there and stop him. But he said, obviously, we couldn't tell everybody what we were doing, so that's why it was so vague. We're not going to announce what kind of technology we're using. But they would implement this, and my uncle and 2 of his co-workers would get awarded at DC. NASA would have an awards banquet every year. In 1963, my uncle and the other 2 would represent Marshall Space Flight Center. Von Braun would take him up there on his plane, and they would receive an award from NASA for that accomplishment, and he was very proud of it, and I was too. Getting back to the test stand, so when they were developing this, getting back to what they would learn, once the engineers did a lot of the engineering tasks, they would be put in charge of quality control. Now we got to build it, right? So he would have to make flights out to California a lot. A lot of electronics were done in California. And he would take out there these capacitors, and they were having major failures. And it was all because of that building. My uncle always said that building saved a lot of lives. So I wanted to share that with you. There was a couple things with that program with my uncle. He decided to leave in '65. He actually wasn't on board during the latter part of NASA's accomplishments with the Apollo program. And the reason why that was, and I actually have some article here, I always bring it, because I always forget. But when they're building the Saturn V, we got a time restraint of getting this done. We lost some astronauts, unfortunately, over that. I'm sure you're all familiar with Apollo 1 disaster. But they were going to subcontract a lot of this out because they needed to get it done quickly. So the IU ring got subcontracted to IBM. And so my uncle decided, he had some friends, of course, always talking with him. He went back to the Army, and he worked for the Defense Department at Redstone because they're developing SAMs, surface-to-air missiles. And he would work on, he was laying the ground floor, him and a couple other people in a department, for the communication of the SAM-D project, surface-to-air missile D. This was the beginning of the Patriot Defense System. So he was on the ground floor. So I thought I'd share that. I think it'd be a good time. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about all the other things that happened during the Apollo program because a lot of people know this history, and of course, if you're really interested in it, you can learn a lot of this. I always ask if we really went, and this is still being discussed today, this blows me away. Did we really go? And you can get on YouTube, believe me, and it's amazing what you can find because there are several that are they're just out there, but they're trying to push this narrative, this conspiracy that we didn't go. Real quickly, all you got to do is get your phone out. Best story that I can tell real quickly, did anybody know that India sent a probe to the moon? The country of India? Anybody aware of this? You know what they did? They put a camera up there that was so accurate, they located the launch site or the landing site of Apollo 11. It's out there. All you gotta do is look for it. It's out there. They win. So I'm gonna open this up for discussion. Yeah.
Tom, one question on your uncle's design for the communication and the blocking computer. Could you tell us what they did? That's the signal to signal?
Excuse me, was it what? Basically, yes. He did elaborate on this later with me, and of course, he would get deep into the technical end of it. But this would be, I always would call this later spread spectrum. This would all evolve later with communication. But basically what it was about, it was a redundancy where the receiver, this is what's getting the information from ground control to the rocket, had to see another signal. If it didn't see that signal, it wouldn't accept the command. So that's what the security was about. Yes. Yes.
I heard you say that von Braun died at 55.
I'm sorry, I misspoke. 65.
65.
Yeah, young
Okay.
age of 65.
What did he die of?
He actually contracted cancer. He died of pancreatic at a young age. Sure did. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention this. I meant to include this real quickly. After the Apollo missions were over, things were, of course, winding down a little bit. There was a lot of people not really happy with the amount of money that was being spent. The senators would get all this feedback and go to the House and say, you know, we got to calm things down here. We're spending too much money. So of course, the Apollo mission would finally end. They would send Von Braun to the headquarters to be the visionary. He got a desk job. It didn't last very long. He got discouraged because he was full driven to do the next thing. Anybody want to guess what the next thing was in his vision? Go to Mars. He was driven. He wanted to do this. Money dried up, and he left NASA. He went to work for a couple of years for Fairchild Industries in the telecommunication explosion of satellites. Yes. Anybody else?
In the 1960s, I think the military budget was probably 33% of our budget. They combined it with the space program, so the camouflage went there. How much do you think the budget was of space in that military budget? My 33% may be wrong. How much do you think was spent on space during the 60s?
I read an article. You know, the funny thing is, I've actually researched for this program for almost a year. I had to delay it a lot because I keep finding new things out. And I wanted to include all of this in the presentation. Of course, we're limited on time. I was told $40 billion.
Okay, that was pretty high then, probably 10 times that now.
Yeah, yes, it was a huge deal.
The second thing you brought up was a Patriot missile. If you look at the Persian Gulf War, when we took on Saddam Hussein in 1989 or 90-91, you had Desert Shield, Desert Storm. If you look at his defense and all his radio communication, the Patriot missile knocked out most of every one of his communication places. So we had a general here that was the first general that flew over Iraq during that period of time, and he presented, he was from Indianapolis, but he was sort of safe because they had no means of communication because of Patriot missiles. I think they practiced some of them down in the Caribbean. The Russians or the Iraqis had Scud missiles and they would fly over our ships, but the Patriot missile really saved a lot of human lives. I think we lost 168 in the Persian Gulf War. We should have lost a lot more if the airplanes and the jets would have had flown over areas without the Patriot missile defense. Can you speak more about the Patriot missile and how accurate they were and what they could do?
That's a good point. You know, I don't have a lot of information from Uncle. When I talked to him about this, he was getting older, and of course his memory was fading a little bit. But I do remember him saying a couple things about this era with that system. Of course, he was doing other things at that time. But he said, you know, it was really never designed to go after those Scuds. I mean, it was designed to be a defense system, but not to chase another rocket. And he was amazed, and so were a lot of other people, of how accurately it did it. It didn't, of course, wasn't 100%, but it did bring a lot of them down, and he was proud of that. I can share that. That's about, I don't know that area. Yes. Yes.
Turn it on. Push that up.
Hi.
It's on.
Hi. I'm curious about the communication between the German scientists and their American colleagues. Obviously, von Braun was fluent eventually, if not originally, in English, having written that article in College. But did they have a lot of translators? I mean, there was
You know-
that language barrier.
Yes, there was. And it took time for them to break that barrier. That's a great topic. My uncle would talk about this a little bit. My uncle would say the first words they would learn in English were in that atmosphere, you could imagine. They learned how to use that part of our language real well. And my uncle would talk about this even when they were in Huntsville, because every once in a while, Von Braun would like to get the chaps together. That's what he called them. I don't know where that came from. But he would like to get them together, and they would just talk about old times or discuss something. And my uncle said you could always hear them down the hall because they were so loud, and about every other word you can imagine what it was. But to answer your question, it was just a learning process. Yes. It was a learning process that they would continue to work with. I can't tell you for sure if they had, I'm sure they had translators there at the beginning, yes. And they would work with Fort Bliss, of course, to improve their communication with the American Army. Yes?
I just wanted to bring this up. It's not directly related to what you're saying, but you mentioned Patriot missile. I worked for Benderson Corporation here in Evansville. We made tool-making equipment, and I had a boat tail section from the Patriot missile, and we worked on warhead sections from the Patriot missile here in Evansville at Benderson Corporation.
That is great to know. I did not know that. No, I'm not real fluent with the Patriot system. I haven't done a whole lot of research. I guess I should. My uncle was on the ground floor of that. But yes, that's great to hear. I'm glad you shared that, Mr. Head. Glad to hear that.
You gotta repeat it for him.
Early start with the Soviets, they obviously attracted them.
Yeah,
Repeat the question.
Yeah, what he's asking about, the Soviets, of course, we were able, and I didn't share a lot on this topic, but we were very organized and we found a list. I think it was Major Staver, if I remember, found a list of all the top leading scientists. It was almost unbelievable that they were flushing the list down the toilet. You can fact check me on this. This is a true story. And they were able to come up with that list. So they were able to find out who's who in this organization. Von Braun's team did not want to be captured by the Soviets. They knew that a lot of them wanted to expand space for exploration. They knew they would have to come with the military, just like Von Braun worked with the military to raise funds when they developed the B-2. But the Soviets did have a plan. They were a little late in the game, but yes, they had a plan to answer your question. They had a plan, but unfortunately for the Soviets, a lot of that group at Peenemünde was already headed south. They invaded Peenemünde first, and Stalin he was ballistic. Not only did they hardly find they found scraps, they found pieces, but all of this went to Middleburg in central Germany. And when the Soviet army showed up, they did get, my uncle would call them second room, is what my uncle would call them. They'd get the ragtag groups that didn't end up going with Von Braun, but they had enough. Real quickly, I'll comment about this, because my uncle shared this with me. They brought what they could find. They were going to reverse engineer the Soviets. They were going to try to copy this. And the leadership, they brought Sergei Korolev on board. He said, we're going to start over. We don't need to do this. And that's how they exploded that technology with the R-7. So yes, they did get some of the, they were also trying, and they did. They were able to take people back. But most of the Germans, I was a little short. I would like to apologize last week. I was a little short with some of my answers. I had stayed up all night. I couldn't get my mind to wind down last week. And a gentleman brought up, why did Von Braun want to go to America, not the Soviets? They didn't like the Soviets, okay? A lot of people today, I see this a lot in our younger generations, that they don't really understand the differences between different countries and their government. They don't really understand what communism is compared to fascism fast, I can't, you have to forgive me, I have a flipper in my, long story. I got some dental work going on, so I'm having a hard time pronouncing words. But, you know, the Germans still believed in, their economy was still an enterprise. You know, it was not like ours, but similar. I mean, we had industry, they had the industry. The government did not control that industry, all right? Well, that wasn't the case in the Soviet Union. And Von Braun's team obviously knew if they were going to go into space, they felt they had a better chance to do it in America. And he would also say it was a moral decision. I know that's kind of hard to comment like that because of what he was exposed with when he was at Middle Baldor with the atrocities at that camp. But anyway, I know it's a long answer, but yes, they did take some back.
Okay, can't thank you enough. Give an applause. I got a couple announcements. March 5th, 2026, we'll meet here. That's our next meeting. Barbara Cole will give the talk. She's probably one of the most respected women veterans, and she's got national awards. She's a local person, Marine Corps retired. And we also have the ritual of the 40 and the 80, the ritual of the tomb of the unknown soldier. Remember, we've lost 1.2 million soldiers during our wars, and half of them are unknown, most of them from the Civil War. So it's a great tribute, and you should know more about it. It mimics a little bit what goes on in Arlington. On March 19, 2026, 2 weeks after that, will be Mike Clark. He will talk about advanced military technology. If you look at what happened just in Venezuela with the SEALs or whatever we had get into Venezuela and get out of there without any problem, that was a hat trick if I ever heard it. But the hat trick was backed up by a lot of science and a lot of new military technology. He will talk about what he's allowed to talk about, and that will be on March 19th. He's a great speaker, and he will talk that day about new military technology that brings us up into the modern age. So thank you for attending. See you at some of our events.
I'd like to invite anybody, I'm gonna stay here a while. If anybody wants to come up and share stories, please come up. Be glad to talk to you. I've got a few exhibits here of my uncle, a little bit about his life. Thank you very much.